is a pressure there in terms of staffing time and the capability of trying to assess all of that.
Move on to questions for the Minister of Justice. We'll start with listed questions. Question 13 has been withdrawn. I call the answer Forsyth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Whilst telecommunications legislation, including the regulation of social media platforms, is a reserved matter, my department has sought to take a proactive approach towards supporting online safety. I had sought to influence the content of the Online Safety Act 2023, urging more to be done to address the lack of accountability of anonymous account holders, which is a key issue in seeking to prevent and detect online harms and offences. I've also recently met with Ofcom representatives to get an update on the implementation of the Online Safety Act and their plans for it to be put into practice. In addition, the member will be aware that I previously held a roundtable forum to take views on tackling online abuse and intimidation, particularly in light of incidents during the last Assembly elections. In the last mandate, I also brought forward legislation which strengthened existing law and introduced new offences such as stalking, upskirting, downblousing and cyber flashing. These offences have added real, tangible and valuable protections against both online and offline abuse. I'm also mindful of the dangers associated with online radicalisation. Our young people in particular are at risk of being radicalised through access to harmful online content. I'm engaged by law enforcement partners about what we can do to address this risk. However, a criminal justice response alone cannot improve online safety. We must take a holistic approach that's focused on prevention and education, as set out in the cross-executive online safety strategy, which has been put in place to assist children and young people to participate in the online world in a positive, safe and responsible way.
Ms. Forsyth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answer and her continued work on this issue. And as you mentioned, as we all know, online abuse starts early in these times where children cannot escape it. Cyberbullying is a huge devastation within our schools and our societies, and our Education Minister has introduced a pilot scheme for magnetic pouches in our schools to address the impact of phones on children. Would the Minister agree this is an opportunity for her to work together and support the Education Minister's initiative to help address cyberbullying and online abuse in schools?
Minister.
I'm very happy to support any minister who is dealing with issues of cyberbullying and online harassment, whether in school or elsewhere. The member will be aware, however, that I have serious concerns about whether or not it is necessary to spend £250,000 in order to do so, when most schools already have both policy and practice in place to deal with those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Lord Elliott.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank the Minister for the update. Just wondering, is she working with other jurisdictions? Is the Minister working with other jurisdictions to try and cut out and stamp out the online bullying? And is there any cooperation from the owners of the websites?
Well, first of all, if I may congratulate the Lord on his elevation. I think this is the first opportunity he's had to ask a question in this House on that basis. I am working very closely with the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology in terms of the work that they're doing, and also with the Home Office around the work that they're doing in terms of radicalisation as well as bullying. I've also recently met with my Scottish counterpart in terms of discussing some of these issues, including online. I think the bottom line is that the various platforms have various degrees of engagement, it would be fair to say. Some take a slightly more radical view and view it as essentially a free-for-all where all is permitted to be said and nothing is out of bounds, whilst others, I think, do try to more robustly enforce some kind of community standards. For me, the key is that at times self-regulation is no regulation in many cases, and so I think that part of my concern certainly is that with self-regulation of these platforms, anything that causes controversy also drives traffic on the site, also drives advertising revenue, and therefore is unlikely to be curtailed by the people who are responsible.
Cara Hunter.
I think reflecting on the Assembly 2022 election was a prime example of what happens when misogyny meets the misuse of technology. So I welcome the Minister's answers so far. Can I ask her just about what conversations she has had perhaps with the Electoral Commission about social media abuse and how this can impact more women getting into politics, and if she has had any discussions with the social media giant companies about this abuse? Thank you.
Minister.
I have discussed this with some of those representative bodies of the social media companies. It's something that that I am concerned about. I know from personal experience of women who have been interested in getting involved in politics, took a cursory glance through some of our collective social media threads and decided that the level of abuse was just intolerable and they wouldn't expose themselves and their families to it. So it is a real issue because we lose out, I think, on a very significant talent pool because people feel intimidated, threatened and are worried about their families in that context. In terms of the Electoral Commission, I haven't had a discrete conversation with the Electoral Commission about this, but I have spoken to some of the electoral commissioners informally around this issue because some of them have approached and asked specifically about the impact it's having on political discourse. Not all of this traffic is driven, I have to say, by legitimate actors. I mean, a number of them are not local people who are criticising our local politicians. A number of them, I think, are funded from rather nefarious sources, and there seems to be a drive, particularly in terms of attacking those who speak up for democratic norms, in terms of undermining them, and particularly, I think, trying to intimidate women who are trying to speak up and raise issues around misogyny, sexism, and other forms of hate. I think it's important, and I reflected this in a recent research interview which I did with a young researcher who is looking into this. It is important that in the context of Northern Ireland, with all the divisions that we have, that we can show a united front when it comes to this kind of abuse, because irrespective of the party political views of the member being attacked, if people are being attacked because of who they are, how they look, the fact that they are a woman or any other defining characteristic, we need to stand united and say it's unacceptable.
Owen Tennyson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for your answers. Minister, is there additional legislation that can be used to tackle those who commit offences in Northern Ireland?
Minister.
I think there is. Many behaviours which constitute criminal offending are treated in the same manner regardless of whether those are carried out offline or online. In addition, the provisions in the Online Safety Act in 2023 create a range of offences that can be used to tackle and prosecute offensive online behaviour, including protection from harassment in the Northern Ireland Order 1997, the Justice Act Northern Ireland 2016, Protection from Stalking Act 2022, Communications Act 2003, and the Justice and Sexual Offences Trafficking Victims Act. It is important to recognise, for example, that stirring up hatred is an offence already under the Public Order Northern Ireland Act 1987, and whilst it may be a dated provision, it is nevertheless one that can still be applied and operated and ought to be where it is appropriate.
Cathy Mason. Minister.
Violence against women and girls is wholly abhorrent, and the stark reality is that in August we saw 2 murders and 1 attempted murder of women in Northern Ireland in a single week. This is shocking, and I think we all have a collective responsibility to take action. My department is fully supportive of the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, which is led by the Executive Office at my request. It was agreed by Executive last week, and I understand plans are now underway for its full publication. I recognise the key contribution that justice can make in terms of reducing risk, enhancing protections, improving victim confidence in the justice system, and holding perpetrators to account when they offend. My department has supported the strategy's development and played an active role in the co-design process. The Minister of Health and I also plan to publish a new domestic and sexual abuse strategy in the coming weeks. This is a gender-inclusive strategy which recognises the impact on male victims as well as female victims. However, women and girls are disproportionately affected by domestic and sexual abuse, and so its implementation will also directly support the delivery of outcomes under the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy.
Jason.
And thank you to the Minister for her answer. Minister, can you outline, in conjunction with that, what work is ongoing between your department and the Education Minister in ensuring any relevant parts of the Violence Against Women and Girls framework is rolled out across the education system as well?
Minister.
Ultimately, responsibility for cross-departmental working on the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy is one that will fall to the Executive Office Ministers to take forward. The First and Deputy First Minister will obviously, in terms of their action plan, which they also hope to publish next week, be inclusive in terms of what contribution individual departments can make. With respect to the domestic and sexual abuse strategy, and indeed the other actions that my department has been taking in order to protect victims of violence, things like Operation Encompass, which was championed by your colleague, actually, Linda Dillon, when she was in the Justice Justice Committee is something that has been very effective in terms of providing better protections and wraparound support for children affected by domestic abuse, and we continue to work with the Department of Education on those projects. And I look forward to further opportunities to do so, because I believe education is absolutely crucial in terms of changing attitudes. By the time my department gets involved, victims have already been created. The further upstream we can go in terms of changing attitudes, the less victimisation will occur.
The majority of violence perpetrated against women is by men, and men with problems seldom seek help or talk about the issues that they're facing. On that basis then, could I ask the Minister what work is being done to engage men and to educate men around these issues and the things that they face that lead them to such behaviours?
Minister.
It's a really important point, because many of the men who are engaged in these behaviours have also been victims of abuse, often as children, and exposed to domestic violence in the home. For many of them, they view it as a normal part of an adult relationship. And therefore, the earlier we can do the education piece and talk about what a healthy relationship looks like, what respect looks like, the better it will be in terms of changing those attitudes. We would all wish that every child would grow up in a home where perfect behaviour between parents in an adult relationship is properly modelled, but unfortunately that is not the case. And therefore, if people model their behaviour off their parents, very often they will perpetuate tragedies of the past. We do work with perpetrators, so for example, those who have been already found guilty, when we come to doing rehabilitation work, whether in prisons or in the community, we will focus on the nature of their offending, the reasons for offending, and taking a trauma-informed approach to doing that. So that's something that already happens. We also offer people, before they have been convicted of an offence, but where complaints have been made, to voluntarily engage with perpetrator programmes and education programmes in order to try and improve things. Those tend to actually perform much better where someone voluntarily engages with a programme, but it is being able to catch those people early enough in the system to prevent serious harm that is the most important part. Where it works, I think it is to everyone's advantage, because it may well mean that that perpetrator can go on and actually have happy, healthy relationships in the future, which I think is to the benefit of everyone in society, not just to their current partner.
Bobby Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for her answer so far. Can I ask the Minister what she will do to protect female prison officers who are often subject to threats of sex-based violence from prisoners, where the psychological effect is not captured within the staff handbook, and therefore sick leave cannot be granted to these women?
Minister.
I think it's a very important point, and I think it speaks to a conversation which I've had not just with prison officers recently, but also with police officers, about the level to which abuse of people in public service generally is almost taken as read, that this is a norm when it should be the exception and should be treated seriously. I think the first thing that is important is if people are engaged in that kind of behaviour, particularly threats of sexual violence or racial abuse or whatever it might be, that should be prosecuted. I think we have to have a zero tolerance approach within the prisons. And the fact that somebody is in prison doesn't mean that they can't still offend within that setting, and so we need to take that seriously too, in exactly the same way as we would treat violence against police and so on who are providing a public service. One of the areas, as you know, that I hope to bring forward in this term around sentencing is an aggravator model to protect those who are engaged in the delivery of a public service or who are public servants themselves. And I would hope that that aggravator will allow us to reflect in sentencing the seriousness of threatening a prison officer, a police officer, a member of the fire service, whoever that might be, a shop worker, a bus driver, to make those threats as very serious and to make threats that would not be acceptable outside of those environments to people who are working in the public sector should not be more tolerable, it should be less tolerable. In doing so, they are affecting their ability to deliver to society and for society, and so I think that aggravator will send out a very strong message.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the progress there has been on the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategic framework. I'm also grateful for the information the Minister has given us today on the work of her own department on a domestic and sexual abuse strategy, and keen to hear more about that. Can I ask you, Mr. Speaker, if the Minister knows that there will be funding forthcoming for that strategy?
Sure.
Well, I think as we've already gathered from the announcement today on the programme for government, funding remains the most challenging issue that faces this executive, and it is particularly challenging in the Department of Justice and indeed in the Department of Health, and this is a shared strategy. Funding and affordability issues do remain challenging, and I cannot excuse the fact that that is the case. And we will continue to have impact in terms of the scale and pace of delivery within the strategy. However, what we have done is look at the statutory and contractual commitments, prioritise those so we can make progress, and try to create a programme around the domestic and sexual abuse strategy, which is scalable depending on the funding that is made available to us. However, Mr. Speaker, if we are to recognise the seriousness of this issue, that people are losing their lives as a result of domestic and sexual abuse, and that people's lives are being irreparably damaged as a result, then we have to let our money follow where our good intentions lead.
Liz Gimmons.
Question number 3, please.
The sentencing bill will deliver on a number of recommendations arising from my department's public consultation on sentencing policy. This will include a statement of the principles and purposes of sentencing, provision to allow further use of community sentences, statutory starting points for life sentence tariff calculation, expansion and simplification of the current unduly lenient sentence referral provisions, creation of a new offence of assaulting those providing a service to the public or performing a public duty, creation of a statutory aggravator for vulnerable victims, and increasing maximum penalties for offences causing death by dangerous driving. The bill will also include measures to encourage the disclosure of the location of victims' remains, to be known as Charlotte's Law, and as indicated in my written ministerial statement this morning, will also include provision for a statutory aggravator for hate crime.
Ms Gimmons.
I can call and thank the Minister for her answer. I note in the last week the Lady Chief Justice has expressed her disappointment that broadcasting of court proceedings will not be implemented in this mandate, and I would therefore ask the Minister why this couldn't be included in the sentencing bill, as I think it's very important, particularly around transparency and public confidence.
Well, it is very important, and it's something that I too would like to see. And the difficulty that we have is, first of all, resources, because we have very limited resource within the department, and indeed within the Office of Legislative Counsel in terms of actually drafting commitments. So there is a challenge there. There is also, I think, a challenge in terms just of the development of policy in this area. So, for example, when it comes to the issue of what would be filmed in court, the current view of the Lady Chief Justice is that it would be in relation to appeal court judgments and rulings. However, you will be aware that very powerfully, we saw in England recently that sentencing remarks are also filmed there. So whilst the pilot only looked at appeal court judgments and rulings, we would want to take a more holistic approach, because what we wouldn't want to do is repeal the current rule which says that all filming in a court is illegal without knowing particularly the detail of what needs to be done. One option I had explored to expedite this was that we could put the repeal, if you like, on ice in a piece of primary legislation, as well as taking regulation powers, but only commence it at the point where the regulations were developed, and then engage with the sector on that basis. I was advised that that was perhaps not good practice in terms of legislation, which is why we didn't proceed down that route. But I do think that there may be some things we can do, even over the course of this mandate, certainly to develop the policy to support that change.
Paula Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for outlining what will be in this sentencing bill. I'm sure that there'll be a lot of different sections of society will be delighted to see the different aspects included in it. As such, can you please outline when the bill will be introduced? Thank you.
Minister.
Well, we anticipate that the bill will be introduced later in 2025. That will be dependent on progress of earlier Assembly business that is going through at the moment. So in the next few weeks, I'm hoping to introduce my mixed content miscellaneous provisions bill, so the modernisation bill. This will be the second bill of the mandate, and then it would be my intention to have a third bill which would relate to victims. An executive paper is currently being prepared by my officials to seek executive approval for the policy content and drafting of the bill during this term, so we can get that underway as soon as possible.
John Stewart.
Minister, the public have lost confidence in the sentencing system, particularly the pitiful sentences for crimes of a sexual nature against women, girls and young people. What more can be done by your department to restore the public confidence?
Well, first of all, it was not something that was consulted on in terms of the sentencing review that was undertaken. Most of the sentencing in Northern Ireland is based around guideline cases and sentencing guidelines, which is a matter for the judiciary and not for the department. We have very limited scope, other than in legislation, to set maximums, and the rest is left to judicial discretion. What we have been able to do, and which I hope has actually shifted the dial in terms of confidence in the justice system in these matters, is in terms of the work we have done with PPS, with the judiciary, and particularly with the PSNI in terms of our response to domestic and sexual violence, to violence against women and girls. And I hope that the strategy that will be laid out in the coming days on behalf of the Executive will further reinforce the fact that this Executive takes a no-tolerance approach to violence against women and girls, and I hope that that is a message that will be well received by the judiciary.
Michelle Brownlee.
I recognise very much the harm that attacks on places of worship can have on members and the wider community. I want to condemn the recent attacks at the Bangladeshi Islamic Centre in Newtonards, the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God at Templemore Street in East Belfast, and the Church of the Holy Name at Green Island, and also recent threats to the Belfast Islamic Centre. My department works collaboratively with policing and community safety partnerships in addressing crime and fear of crime. PCSPs have a legislative duty to address crime, fear of crime and antisocial behaviour, and to do so by working collaboratively and engaging with their local community. Specific crime prevention advice is also available from the PSNI. During the recent disorder, the Home Office extended its protection scheme for mosques in the UK, which are vulnerable to hate crime, to provide emergency support. The Home Office also supports the Community Security Trust to provide protections for synagogues across the UK. Protection schemes for places of worship in England and Wales are based solely on vulnerability to hate crime. However, to date there has been insufficient evidence to show that such a scheme is needed in Northern Ireland. We will of course keep that under review.
Ms. Brownlee.
Thank the Minister for her answers so far. You just touched on the devastating fire that happened recently within Green Island. So it's just to ask the Minister, in terms of that preventative measures, what is being implemented to educate young people on the dangers and the legal consequences of arson?
Minister.
It's something that I wouldn't be directly involved in terms of that, but I think the wider issue that is important to kind of reference is the fact that, and we should be encouraged, I suppose, that only about 4% of attacks on what we would call significant key buildings, so places of worship, orange halls, GAA clubs, only about 4% of those have been identified as being driven by a hate motive. In the majority of cases, they're driven by antisocial behaviour and criminal damage motivations. Now, okay, that's no comfort if your building is absolutely destroyed in those circumstances, but it does show that in terms of deliberate attacks on buildings because they are places of worship, that is a relatively small part of the overall picture. I think it's also important to note that we are looking at antisocial behaviour orders as part of another piece of work the department is doing and how those can be used. Also, the Youth Justice Agency, in the recent Sagini report, they were very much praised for the work that they've been doing in terms of trying to deter youth offending. So where it's young people involved in that antisocial behaviour, I think there are opportunities, particularly through PCSPs and community engagement, to get the engagement of the PSNI and the Youth Justice Agency before people engage in serious offending. But undoubtedly it is devastating for those in the congregation to see their church razed to the ground.
I call Matthew Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today, Minister, you said that you would not be proceeding with standalone hate crime legislation. That comes after some of the most shocking race hate that this region has ever seen. People in ethnic minority communities and religious minorities will feel, I think many of them, let down. How can you say there isn't enough time to proceed with a standalone hate crime bill when today and tomorrow we are literally spending hours debating non-binding Executive Party motions?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the order of business here is not agreed by me, it is agreed by the Business Committee, and all parties have members on the Business Committee. If people are annoyed about what is the content of the order paper, I think it's for them to take up with the member of the Business Committee who represents them. However, with respect to the time I have available to me, as I have said, I'm about to introduce quite an extensive piece of legislation. and therefore that is the first one. It's already been prepared, the policy development work has been done, and it is ready to go. I wanted, when I came back into office, and I realised in February it would not be possible, it was going to be the fourth bill of a 5-bill series. And I realised that that would put it into the next mandate, which I did not want to happen. And so what I did, before what happened over the summer, before those considerations, I brought forward and expedited the most impactful parts of that legislation. I have engaged with the sector, I have engaged with the BAME community, with the Islamic community, I have engaged with the LGBTQI community and many others who will be impacted by this. And most of them recognise that the most impactful pieces of Judge Marinen's report are those pieces which will first of all create the aggravator and allow additional categories of protected characteristics to be added to that aggravator, and those that will provide special measures in court. The remainder of Judge Marinen's report we will proceed with in the department in terms of policy development, because some of it will require cross-departmental working and will also require full executive buy-in. But what I wanted to do was get the most impactful part of this through in this mandate, because I agree completely with the member. The behaviours that we have seen on the streets of Belfast and other towns and cities across the UK and these islands is not acceptable. It is not who we are or aspire to be, and I want to be sure that there is every opportunity through the courts to make sure that people face the consequences of their actions.
Very cool.
Attacks on places of worship need to be condemned. We've obviously seen a rise in attacks on mosques and Islamophobia at really nasty levels. Minister, and what your assessment that the PSNI think the loyalist paramilitaries have a role to play in stopping racist violence, or that they aren't involved in racist attacks themselves, because that's certainly contrary to the experience of many people across our communities, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, I know that Mel Jones, in her comments publicly, has stated that she believed that there were paramilitaries involved in some of that violence, and she's been very clear about that. However, irrespective of whether paramilitaries are involved or not, the behaviour is not acceptable, and I think it is important that all of us speak with one voice. It is hugely frustrating, I have to say, to see people who come here either to serve this community by working in our public services or in private industry to grow our economy, or who come here in desperation seeking protection from harm at home. And to find them, instead of being welcomed and respected and treated with dignity, to find them being terrorised in their homes and in their communities, it is completely unacceptable. And if there are things that my department can do, in addition to those actions that we already take in terms of support, we will continue to explore those, both with those sectors that best represent those voices, but also with our executive colleagues to make sure that this is a joined-up approach.
Dixon.
Thank you, Minister, for your answers so far. Minister, we saw some appalling scenes across Northern Ireland this summer, not just only attacks on churches and property, but also on individuals. What action is being done by your department, and what conversations have you had to protect minority communities across Northern Ireland?
Well, as I've said, I'm committed to playing my part in terms of delivering that safer community for everyone, including victims of race hate crime, and in partnerships with others in government and beyond. DOJ, PSNI, the Housing Executive and the Department for Communities continue to jointly fund the Hate Incident Practical Action Scheme. That allows, in particular circumstances, personal and home protection measures if your home has been damaged or you've been the victim of an incident or crime at home because of your race, sexual orientation, disability, gender identity, political opinion or religious belief. In addition to legislative protections for victims, direct support for hate crime victims is also provided through the Hate Crime Advocacy Service, jointly funded by PSNI and DOJ, and that supports victims of hate crime through the criminal justice process, signposts them to the relevant support services, and can assist with third-party reporting. PSNI and crime prevention officers can also provide crime prevention advice, and I would encourage people affected to keep in contact with the PSNI and ensure that all incidents of crime and antisocial behaviour are reported, no matter how insignificant they may seem at the time. Policing and community safety partnerships also work to identify issues of concern within the local area and prepare plans to deliver practical solutions. Also, the recently launched Help in Hand app is designed to help victims of race hate crime and BAME communities understand the processes of reporting hate crime to police while providing useful information and details of support. And the app is initially available in 5 different languages. However, building relationships in our community and more cohesive communities is what will really make a difference, and a whole executive approach is required if we're going to tackle this. The development of strategies such as the racial equality strategy, refugee integration strategy, and all of the other anti-bullying guidance and so on, and hate crime within the curriculum by DE, and working with the Department for the Economy, stakeholders and PCSPs to support victims is hugely important, and it is not just a matter only for justice, it has to be a matter for all of us in our society.
We now move to questions, topical questions to the Minister of Justice. Call Justin McNulty.
Minister, more than 3 years ago, the Marianne Review made it clear that we need standalone hate crime legislation. In your first day brief, you confirmed that while the institutions were collapsed, work had been ongoing to prepare a hate crime bill, and your legislative programme for the remainder of this mandate will be triaged on the basis of emerging priorities. Given the surge in racist violence in Belfast and beyond this summer, and the tragic death of my constituent Anna Okusanya on the 24th of August, how is your U-turn that you announced this morning on your commitment to introduce standalone hate crimes legislation consistent with both the standards and the priorities that you have set out for yourself and your department?
First of all, can I extend again my sympathy to Anna's family? It is, I think, one of the most horrific cases that I have heard, and I think speaks to us all about the abject terror in which many people in our community are currently living. Where they are so frightened, so fearful of attack, of abuse, of threat. And it is not a unique story in the sense that there are many in our community who no longer use public transport, who don't go out at night, who are afraid to go to work because of the perceived threat against them. That cannot be tolerable. However, what the member has suggested as a U-turn has not been that. It has been exactly what I set out, that I would triage against emerging priorities. And the reality is that in a 3-year mandate, it is impossible to do the full hate crime bill because not all the policy development work was possible in the absence of ministers, and it will require considerable executive input, particularly to the public order elements. However, the remainder of Judge Marinan's recommendations with respect to tackling hate crime directly impacting on victims will be brought forward in this mandate, which was not the original intention in the first day brief, but was something which I pressed for as Minister, and so that has now been accelerated. To reassure the member, I have also spoken with Judge Marinan directly, and whilst he, like me, shares a degree of frustration that we cannot move faster on this, he does accept that the two pieces that I am moving forward in terms of the aggravator and the special measures are the priority for victims of hate crime, and the remainder can then be dealt with in the next mandate.
Minister, you've emphasised the 2 years lost during the Strengths Assembly, but you're also on record as saying your officials have been working on your legislative programme for 4 years. You've emphasised the human resource constraints within your department, yet your officials have found the time to engage in grandiose spats with the Chief Constable. You've been unambiguous on the need for standalone hate crime legislation. Most people would recognise the recent racist violence only amplifies the need for such legislation to be progressed urgently. Do you concede that your U-turn today sends out a very disheartening message to victims of hate crimes, and that your money and your mouth are in totally different places?
Minister.
Setting aside the rather vulgar framing of the question, Mr Speaker, to be absolutely clear, my heart, my mind and my efforts are all directed in one direction, and that is to ensure that we have the best possible law and legislation in place at the end of this mandate to protect victims of hate crime and to give them access to additional protections in court. It is not me, I have to say, that has been engaged in grandiose spats and distraction politics. I have been focused on what my department can do, and my officials have worked very hard, but with respect, Mr Speaker, my officials cannot take decisions on what are controversial issues politically. That requires a minister to be in place, and therefore the public order elements of Judge Marinan's report, which cover the same ground in many cases as the Ficht Commission report, for any of you who might cast your minds that far back, are likely to take significant effort. I do not want to hold up interventions that will support victims in the here and now, awaiting for something that may be essential in my view, but purely aspirational to other members of the Executive.
Deborah Erskine.
Speaker, the Minister will know that morale in policing is at an all-time low. Has she discussed this with the Chief Constable? And if so, what steps is the Minister taking to build confidence within the police between her department and this Assembly?
Well, the first thing to say is that I have discussed it at length with the Chief Constable, and his assessment is somewhat different, because he believes that actually morale is much better in the police service than when he took over, that things have improved significantly during that period and that morale is improving. In terms of what I am doing to work with the Chief Constable in terms of improving morale further, there are a number of things. First of all, I have looked at, in terms of the staff, the revised Environmental Alliance. I've worked with the Chief Constable and with the unions to assure that there was no strike this summer. We have put in place an interim payment to all members of staff, and in addition we hope to resolve the issue completely at the end of September, start of October, and we are on track to do that. I'm also, when I came into office, I instructed my officials to move ahead with the statutory entitlement to incremental pay, which kicks in on the 1st of September, irrespective of whether the wider issue of discretionary pay awards could be resolved in that time frame. So every officer will get at least part of their pay settlement sooner rather than later, and the remainder then to be decided once executive pay policy is in place. And I have also sat with the Chief Constable at length, going through a business case for stabilisation and recovery. That will have to go to executive for approval, and I'm very encouraged by the interest in policing that has emerged over the summer, and I look forward to the full support of all parties in the House for those plans.
Ms Erskine.
Again, I thank the Minister. I've always supported policing, and I've always wanted to stand up for our police force here in Northern Ireland, because they are the people that protect our communities and help support people in our communities. And the Minister has outlined a number of things and a number of steps there that she has been doing, and I appreciate that. So therefore, in that context, does the Minister agree then that adequate funding and increasing police numbers would actually support and help create better morale, and therefore does she support the Chief Constable who took steps to request more funding and support over the summer, a man who is passionate about his workforce and is trying to invest in them and fight for them?
Minister.
At the end of the day, what it is about is working with the Chief Constable through the structures that we have. The reality is, in the devolved institutions, money that comes to Northern Ireland is not hypothecated. It is actually for this Assembly, on the basis of recommendations brought by the Executive, to vote through a budget and decide how we spend our money locally. And so that is the reality of the situation, that even were the Chief Constable to be successful in lobbying in Westminster, that money will come to the Department of Finance, and it will be for us around the Executive table and in this room to decide where that money ends up. So the important thing is that I work closely, as I have been, with the Chief Constable to build the strongest possible case at the Executive table, so that funding that does come to Northern Ireland actually makes it into the Department of Justice's budget, because to date that has not been the case. And I can give a tangible example of where there was a £22 million investment due, if you like, to the Department of Justice based on COVID recovery, of which less than £6 million came to the department and the rest was absorbed by the Department of Health. So if we continue to act in that way, my department will continue to be underfunded and the PSNI will continue to be underfunded. That's not a situation that either you or I would wish to have in place. So what we need to do is work together around having that robust case made. I agree increasing numbers would be helpful, and it is part of that stabilisation process that we're now engaged in. But in order to increase numbers, we have to first increase finances. We have to put the current service on a sustainable footing. And the other thing that will help morale is ensuring that where officers are attacked in the street, where they are pelted, for example, in riots, that is taken as seriously by PPS and the courts as any attack on a member of the public. It affronts me, frankly, when I hear it reported, for example, that 40 people were injured in a riot and 4 police officers. 4 police officers are also people. They have families and there are consequences. And so we need more and more to stop accepting that the police should be there as some kind of a battering ram for society. We need to protect them, and I'm hopeful that the legislation coming through next year will achieve that.
I call Peter Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask, is the Minister aware of the immense pressure that the PSNI is under? And she's just alluded to it. And has she therefore considered reconfiguring other budget areas within her own department to release or divert additional money to the PSNI at this time?
Sure.
Well, I understand that the member is new to the House and I want to welcome him to his place, but anyone who has been in this House for slightly longer will have heard me make these same cases over and over again. We have a projected overspend of £34 million this year, and that is the things that we know will crystallise, so that is inescapable expenditure. We have another couple of £100 million just sitting off to the side waiting to crystallise, and if it does we will have significant challenges. I have had to ask every part of my department to make savings. This is not unique to the PSNI. Every single part of my department is operating on less resource than it would ideally have. And the overall share that the PSNI have had of the department's budget has not really changed. Because if I do that, let me just put this in context, if I fund the police at the expense of probation, then more people will go to prison and we will need more money for prisons. If I invest in policing at the expense of prisons, then we will have to start looking at what they're looking at in England in terms of early release, because we will not be able to manage our prison numbers. If I invest in policing to the expense of courts, then the police will be arresting people, but there will be no opportunity to get them before the courts and have them charged and tried. So I have a job to do which is different to the Chief Constable. His job is, of course, to advocate for policing. My job is to advocate for policing and justice. It is a complete system and we need a holistic approach. And I have to say those cases have worked best when we have all been in the same space, the judiciary, PPS, the department, probation and the police service, arguing the same case for the same issues. And that is how we got the cross-departmental funding and the cross-sectoral funding that allowed us to do COVID recovery.
Mr. Martin.
I thank the Minister for her answer. Just following on from what she said, does she stand by the letter from her Permanent Secretary to the Chief Constable admonishing him for asking for additional financial resources directly from the Prime Minister? And could you tell us if she was cited on the letter before it was sent, and does she support its contents?
The role of the accounting officer is the one role that I, as Minister, do not have oversight of in terms of my department. In fact, the reverse. It is the accounting officer who oversees my directions on expenditure. And so I am not cited on his correspondence in his role as accounting officer. And to be frank, it has not been helpful that this was leaked into the public domain, because it has created, I think, a very false narrative of the relationship between the department and the Chief Constable, and certainly between myself and the Chief Constable. That relationship has been very strong, and I would just remind members before we have a debate on this later today that at the Policing Board last Thursday, as recently as last Thursday, the Chief Constable said that he wished to draw a line under this. So perhaps if we're so concerned about policing and the Chief Constable, we might want to take his advice.
Alan Chambers.
Minister, given that Justice Schofield decided that MJ in the former Chief Constable's dialogue relating to the Ormer Road incidents referred to Justice Minister, and the Ormer Road incident was the catalyst for the review of the Policing Board, is the Minister considering excusing herself from this process and the scoping of the review?
No, I am not, and for the simple reason that it was clarified at the Policing Board, though I accept not during your term of office, by the then Chief Constable, that it did not relate to me and that I at no time engaged with him either to advise or pressure him on the actions that he took.
Mr. Chambers.
Thank you. Minister, do you not think that there's enough doubt to undermine the process, and for transparency you should do the right thing, as there is certainly a perceived conflict?
Minister.
To be clear, your colleague supported this in the Policing Board on his tenure there, who's now the Health Minister, and was content with the approach being taken. There is no doubt in my mind, Mr Speaker, I at no time have sought to influence the Chief Constable in terms of operational matters. In fact, I'm regularly castigated in this chamber when I refer to the tripartite arrangements and the fact that I can't encroach on operational matters. So no, I will not be recusing myself. There is no doubt in my mind, and I suggest you speak to your colleague, Mr Nesbitt, and perhaps he can remove any doubt in your mind.
Mr. Kelly.
Well, Minister, I was going to ask you to outline, had you any engagement recently with the British Government on the Home Office scheme for additional security measures at places of worship? You did mention it earlier on, and I'm just worried I didn't pick it up right, because I thought you said that on the basis, you have spoken to him, but on the basis of the numbers of attacks on places of worship, some of which were ASB, I just wanted to clarify that you weren't able to pursue that, or is the Home Office which is in charge of this, or can something be done in the north?
We've got less than a minute, Minister.
There are a number of different strands, so perhaps it's best, given the restricted time, that I write to the member, but there is a security around mosques scheme that the government run, which is available to Northern Ireland. There's also the Community Safety Trust, which deals with synagogues. We don't have a scheme that is comparable to the one in England and Wales, because it only deals with those places of worship that are affected by hate crime, and only 4% of attacks on churches or other notable buildings in Northern Ireland are hate crime related. The majority of them are antisocial behaviour, but I'll pop it in writing to the member if that would be helpful.
Thank you, Minister. And that concludes questions to the Ministers for Justice. If members would take their ease whilst we change the top table before the next item.